Marcus spent 3 years telling Amara that a woman who came from nothing would always return to nothing, until the night she ran, and sat beside the one man in the city who had built an empire out of exactly that. The train cut through the city like a blade through dark water. Amara Niel pressed herself into the corner of the seat, her neatly styled braids damp against her neck, her fingers locked around the strap of the small bag that held the only version of her life she was willing to carry forward. She had chosen the far end of the carriage deliberately, a reflex, the way women learn to calculate exits before they calculate destinations. The window beside her gave back a reflection she barely recognized. Her smooth dark skin caught the cold blue light of the train's interior, and the swelling along her jawline made her expressive eyes look larger than usual, and more hollow. She studied the reflection the way you study a stranger, with clinical distance, because looking at it as yourself was still too much. The other passengers were ordinary. A man in a delivery jacket. A woman scrolling a phone. An older couple sharing a bag of something warm. Some glanced at her and then away, performing the small mercy of not staring. Marcus had taught her to read that look. She has nobody. That was the sentence he had installed inside her over 3 years, patient, methodical, the way you lay a foundation before you build the walls. You have no family worth calling. No one in this city who would pick up for you. If you leave into nothing. She had left anyway. Her wide eyes tracked the carriage doors every time the train decelerated. Her jaw was tight and her breath was shallow and controlled, the breathing of someone who has learned not to let their chest rise too visibly in the presence of danger. She didn't know yet where she was going. She only knew the direction, away. Then the air changed. It happened without announcement, a shift in pressure, the way a room changes when a door opens onto cold weather. A scent drifted toward her, something composed and expensive, cedar layered beneath something sharper, almost metallic, the smell of a world that did not ask permission. Amara's instincts, the ones Marcus had sharpened without meaning to, pulled her attention sideways before her mind had decided to look. Kang Jae-hyun sat beside her as though the seat had always been his. He was a Korean man with a clean, architectural face and styled black hair swept back with the kind of deliberateness that suggested everything about him had been deliberately considered. He wore a black suit over a white shirt, no tie, the collar open just enough to reveal the edge of something dark at his throat, ink, she realized. His hands, resting on his knees with total stillness, told the same story. He wore a watch that cost more than the apartment she had just left. He was not looking at the window. He was not looking at his phone. He was looking at nothing, and yet the quality of his attention filled the entire carriage. Unlike every other passenger, he had not glanced at her injuries and looked away. He had not performed discomfort or pity. He simply existed beside her, a pillar of engineered calm in a moving train, and the stillness of him was more unnerving than anything Marcus had ever thrown at a wall. Amara's grip tightened on her bag. She understood in the wordless, cellular way that women understand certain things that she had not sat beside a safe man. She had sat beside a man for whom danger was simply the climate he governed. She stared forward. So did he. And the train carried them both deeper into the dark. The night before her wedding, Amara moved through her mother's house like water finding its level, quietly, without resistance, filling each task because stillness would have been worse. She folded the last of her clothes into the canvas bag on the bed. She checked the zip twice. She set it by the door. The house was small and the walls were thin enough that she could hear her mother's voice in the next room, low and practiced, the tone she used when she was explaining something to herself rather than to anyone who could answer back. The debt was not new. It had lived in the house for years the way damp lives in old walls, invisible until you pressed too hard against something and felt it give. Kang Jae-hyun's people had not come with threats. They had come with paper, and a number, and a patience that was somehow more frightening than urgency. Amara was the answer her family had arrived at. No one had said it that plainly. They hadn't needed to. She was 19 and she understood leverage. She understood that love and duty were not the same architecture, and that what her mother felt watching her pack that bag was not relief but the specific grief of a woman who had run out of other options. Amara did not blame her for it. That was the part she had already finished feeling. She moved to the small mirror above the dresser, the one with the cracked corner her mother had always meant to replace. Her wide, dark eyes looked back at her, steady and dry. She smoothed one braid back from her face. In the morning there would be a car. There would be a ceremony brief enough to feel administrative. There would be a man in a wheelchair at the end of a room she had never been inside. She picked up the bag. She did not allow herself a last look around the room. She had learned early that looking back at things you were leaving only made the leaving heavier, and she needed every gram of herself for what came next. The compound did not look like a prison. That was the first thing Amara noted, and the noting of it was itself a kind of warning. The car had moved through 3 security checkpoints before the main gates, each one manned by people who were too still and too watchful to be ordinary staff. The building beyond was all clean stone and controlled landscaping, expensive, precise, the aesthetic of a man who had decided that power did not need to announce itself through excess. It simply needed to be undeniable. Kang Jae-hyun was waiting in the main room. He was seated in a wheelchair positioned at the center of the space with the deliberateness of a throne. He wore black, a fitted shirt, dark trousers, everything tailored to a body that was lean and structured even in stillness. His face was sharp-featured and composed, the kind of face that had learned early to give nothing away without deciding to. His styled black hair was swept back cleanly. His hands rested on the arms of the wheelchair with a relaxed authority that made the chair feel less like a limitation and more like a choice. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at balance sheets, with full attention, and without sentiment. "You'll find the house runs on a simple principle," he said. His voice was level and unhurried. "Everything here functions. Nothing is wasted. That applies to everyone inside these walls." He paused. "Including you." It was not a threat. It was a policy. A woman named Director Shin showed her the rest, her suite, the schedule, the specific wings of the compound she was permitted to move through freely and the ones she was not. The explanation was courteous and complete, the way instructions are when the expectation of compliance is absolute. That night, Amara lay in the center of a bed that was too large and too quiet, and she ran back through every detail of the day the way her mother had taught her to count change, carefully, twice, looking for what didn't add up. Jae-hyun's men did not look at him with the careful softness people reserved for the vulnerable. They looked at him the way a compass needle looks at north. She pressed that observation flat and filed it somewhere she could find it again. The weeks built themselves around routine the way scar tissue builds around a wound, quietly, and with a function that was almost indistinguishable from healing. Amara learned the shape of Jae-hyun's days before she learned anything else about him. He was awake before the house. He took his coffee without speaking and read documents that were always face down before she entered the room. He worked through the mornings with the concentrated stillness of someone for whom time was a resource too finite for waste. In the afternoons, men came and went from the study, quiet, deliberate exchanges that ended when she appeared and resumed, she understood, when she left. She was not warm to him. She was not cold. She was functional, because that was the language the compound spoke and she had always been quick with languages. She managed his medications, his schedule, the precise choreography of a household organized entirely around one man's requirements. She did it well. She had been doing variations of this her whole life, making herself useful enough that the people around her felt secure. What surprised her was that Jae-hyun never acknowledged it with gratitude, which meant he never made her feel like a service. He simply received her competence as a given, the way you receive air, and something in that, the absence of performance on both sides, made the days easier than she had expected. She caught herself studying him. The way a particular document could hold his attention for an hour without his expression shifting once. The precise angle at which he turned his head when something in a conversation didn't satisfy him. The fact that he never raised his voice, because he had clearly decided long ago that volume was a tool for people who had not yet secured their authority. She told herself it was practical knowledge. Understanding him made the work easier. Then one evening he looked up from his reading without warning and said, "You count the exits every time you enter a room. You've been doing it since the first day." He returned to his document. Amara stood in the doorway of the study and felt the specific unsteadiness of someone who has just realized the observation has been going both ways. It started with the door. East corridor, third from the end. Every other room in the compound had a function she had been shown or could reasonably deduce. This one had no label, no explanation, and a lock that was newer than the hardware around it. She noted it the first week and filed it without weight. By the third time she passed it and found herself slowing down without deciding to, she understood that her body had already assigned it significance her mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then there was the meeting. She had been returning from the kitchen when the voices reached her through the half-open door of the East study, not the content, but the architecture of the exchange. She recognized the voices of two men she had seen defer to Jae-hyun with the particular efficiency of people who did not waste deference. What stopped her in the corridor was not what was being said but how Jae-hyun was saying it. The voice was low and unhurried, the way it always was, but beneath the composure was a precision that did not belong to a man navigating his world from a position of limitation. It was the voice of someone issuing the final word on something that had never been open for discussion. She moved on before the door could open. She began, without consciously deciding to, keeping a record. Not written down, she wasn't ready to make it that real, but catalogued in the careful internal ledger she had been maintaining since childhood, the one where she stored the things that didn't add up until she understood why they didn't. The way his men moved through a room he was already in, a subtle reorganization, like iron filings responding to a field. The way Director Shin paused before answering certain questions, not from ignorance but from the practiced caution of someone choosing their words inside a hierarchy. The medications she administered each morning that she had looked up quietly and found no obvious correlation with paralysis. She didn't know yet what she was building. But the structure was taking shape in the dark, the way things do when the truth has already decided to surface and is simply waiting for you to be ready. Sleep had been unreliable since the first night in the compound, but this was different. This was the particular wakefulness of a body that knows something the mind is still refusing to finalize. She rose at 2 without checking the time. She knew it the way you know weather, by the quality of the silence. She pulled a cardigan over her shoulders and moved into the corridor, telling herself she was going to the kitchen, because having a destination made the restlessness feel less like fear. She had reached the East corridor before she heard it. Footsteps. Not the soft, compensatory shuffle of someone navigating the dark carefully. Not the rolling quiet of wheels on polished floor. These were footsteps, measured, even, the unhurried stride of someone completely at home in their own body, moving through their own space at 2 in the morning without apology or effort. Amara went still against the wall. The door at the end of the corridor, the third from the end, the one with the newer lock, was not fully closed. A thin bar of low light fell across the floor. She should have turned back. She understood in the same wordless register that had kept her alive inside Marcus's apartment that what was on the other side of this moment could not be unfound. She looked anyway. Through the gap, in the low amber light of the private study, Kang Jae-hyun was standing. Not rising. Not struggling. Standing, straight-spined and still, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture carrying the relaxed authority she had watched him project from a wheelchair for months. The wheelchair itself sat behind him like a prop waiting to be returned to the stage. He was looking at something on the desk, his expression unchanged, his body entirely at ease in its own capability. She did not make a sound. She stood in the dark while the last several months rearranged themselves inside her, every careful exchange recontextualized, every silence reweighted, every moment she had read as restraint now legible as architecture. When she finally returned to her room, she did not cry. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands flat on her knees, and she stayed there until the shock finished moving through her and what remained was something cooler and more useful. She decided, in that stillness, what kind of woman she was going to be from this moment forward. Not the woman who had packed a bag and called it survival. Not the woman who had made herself functional inside someone else's design. Someone who required the truth. And would not move until she had it. She was at his door at the usual time with the usual tray and the usual word count, which was almost none. The morning had a surface and she stayed on it. She moved through the compound's routine with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to every day before this one, and if something behind her eyes had rearranged itself in the dark, she did not allow it visible real estate. She had learned this from years of practice long before she arrived here, the particular discipline of a face that gives the room nothing to work with. Jae-hyun watched her more carefully than usual. She felt it the way you feel a change in temperature, a peripheral awareness that his attention had shifted register. He said nothing beyond the ordinary. She answered within the ordinary. The surface held. It was the compound that talked. A conversation she passed in the corridor, two of his men, low-voiced, using a name she didn't recognize paired with a city she did, in a context that had nothing to do with legitimate business. A map left open on the side table in the east study, the door uncharacteristically ajar, showing districts of the city annotated in a shorthand that was clearly internal and clearly operational. Director Shin, on a call she ended too quickly when Amara rounded the corner, using the specific tone of someone managing a situation rather than scheduling an appointment. Amara absorbed each fragment without breaking her stride and placed them in the ledger she had been keeping since the first week. By afternoon the picture they assembled was not a shock. It was a confirmation. The compound was not the household of a wealthy, incapacitated man. It was a command infrastructure. The wheelchair was not a fact of his life. It was a deliberate and sustained performance, maintained with the same precision he applied to everything. The lie was not casual. She understood that now with a clarity that was almost cold. It had been built carefully, over time, at cost, which meant it had a reason. That did not make it forgivable. But a lie with architecture was a lie worth understanding before she decided what to do with it. She went to him that evening after the compound had settled into its night routines, when the corridors were quiet and there was no architecture of daily function left to hide inside. She closed the study door behind her. She did not sit. She laid it out the way he had taught her, without heat, without performance, with the clean precision of someone who has organized their evidence and decided that clarity is more devastating than volume. The door. The meeting she had heard. The map. The medications that did not correspond. The way his men looked at him. The footsteps in the east corridor at 2 a.m, and the door that was not fully closed, and the man standing on the other side of it with his hands clasped behind his back like someone who had never needed a wheelchair in his life. She did not ask if it was true. She had moved past that question. Jae-hyun sat, in the wheelchair, the fact of it now almost abstract between them, and he did not deny a word of it. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she understood he was not searching for a deflection. He was deciding how much of the truth she had earned. Every person close to me becomes a liability, he said finally. My enemies do not come for me directly. They come for the people beside me. He looked at his hands. The wheelchair removed me from the category of threat. It made me appear diminished. It kept the people inside these walls from becoming instruments used against me. He paused. I intended this marriage to be a transaction. Contained. I did not intend, he stopped. Something shifted in Amara's chest, not softening, but fracturing along a different line. She had prepared for denial. She had prepared for cold justification. She had not prepared for the unfinished sentence. Protection without consent, she said, her voice steady and precise as a blade, is just a quieter kind of cage. The silence that followed was absolute. She watched something move across his composed face, not guilt exactly, but its more honest cousin. For the first time since she had entered this compound, Kang Jae-hyun looked like a man who did not have the next move prepared. It was the most human she had ever seen him. It did not make her feel victorious. It made the whole thing heavier. The emissary arrived 3 days later in a car that was deliberately unremarkable and with credentials that were deliberately legitimate. A legal representative, Director Shin announced, here on a matter of personal concern to Mrs. Kang. The title still sat strangely. Amara received him in the front sitting room because refusing would have told him something she wasn't ready to confirm. He was a mild-looking man with careful eyes and the practiced neutrality of someone paid to deliver difficult things without personal exposure. He set nothing on the table between them. The offer was entirely verbal, which told her it had been constructed by someone who understood how evidence worked. He outlined it with the clean efficiency of a transaction that had already been decided. Leave the compound. Provide a single recorded account of what she had witnessed, the wheelchair, the lie, the nature of the operation she had been living inside. In exchange, enough money to rebuild from the point at which she had entered this marriage, plus sufficient additional resources to ensure she never needed to make that kind of calculation again. Everything she had given up at 19. Returned, with interest. He folded his hands and waited. Amara looked at him for a moment. What happens to him, she said, if I take the offer? The emissary smiled, a small, prepared smile, the kind that acknowledged the question while declining to be troubled by it. That, he said, would not be your concern. The offer had been real. The money had been real. The version of her life it represented, the one that did not involve compound walls or locked east wing doors or a man who had built an entire architecture of deception around her, that had been real too. She stood with it for a long moment, giving it the full weight it deserved. Then she turned and walked toward the east wing. They came before dawn, which meant they had someone inside who knew the compound's rhythms. Amara noted that without surprise. She had spent enough months inside those rhythms to understand exactly how readable they were to anyone paying attention. The alarm was not loud. It was a shift in the compound's atmosphere. Doors closing in a specific sequence, the particular silence of men moving with purpose. Amara was already dressed. She had not slept. She walked to the war room because she knew where it was, had known for weeks, and because the east wing door was finally open. Jae-hyun was already at the central table when she entered, his posture carrying the absolute composure of someone operating inside a situation they had already mapped. He was standing. He did not look at the door when she came through it. He moved a fraction to the left, creating space beside him at the table. Not behind him. Beside. She took it. What followed was not chaos. It was the compound functioning at the level it had always been built for, Jae-hyun directing with the economy of someone who had run this calculation before, Amara tracking the compound's interior movements with the knowledge of a woman who had spent months counting exits and learning the weight of every silence in every corridor. When one of his men hesitated over the east entrance, she told him what she knew about its blind spots. He acted on it without question. It was over in under an hour. When the compound settled back into quiet, the kind of quiet that follows something that has been decided, Jae-hyun turned to face her. He did not offer gratitude, she had not expected him to. He offered something more costly. The full version, unstructured and unarmored, his real name in the hierarchy, the actual scope of what she had been living inside, what maintaining the lie had required of him across the years before she arrived and the months since. He gave it to her without managing her response to it. Amara listened until he was finished. Then she looked at him for a long moment, not weighing him, exactly, but deciding the terms of what came next. I'm not staying because I've forgiven you, she said. I'm staying because I've decided this is mine now too. And I will not be kept blind inside my own house again. Jae-hyun held her gaze. No, he said. You won't. The wheelchair stood empty in the corner of the room. Neither of them looked at it. It had already become what it actually was, not a lie, exactly, but the shed skin of a strategy that no longer had anything to protect. The woman who had packed a bag at 19 and called it survival was gone. In her place stood someone who had looked at the full cost of her choices and decided what they were worth. She turned back to the table. There was work to do.